Welcome back to the second day of the symposium. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Mark Leonard. I'm head of the museum's Paintings Conservation Department here at the Getty. We have a very full program this morning. So just as a reminder, there are speakers' bios in your registration packets. So the introductions will be short, if non-existent, this morning. And those of you who would like to know more about our speakers can feel free to read their more extensive biographies in your packets. I wanted to take a couple of minutes to provide just a bit of background as to how this particular session came about and what we might hope to accomplish with it. The focus of our attention during this symposium is the structural treatment of panel paintings, but the reason we are focused upon this is, of course, because of their importance as works of art, and because of their roles not only in collections, both public and private, but also in the increasingly vast world of museum exhibitions. Attitudes towards the use of panel paintings in exhibitions have changed dramatically since many of us first entered the field. And while thinking about this session, two very specific examples came to mind from my own experience, which might help illustrate how the field's perspectives have changed over the past couple of decades. In 1991, a friend of mine in New York City was putting together an exhibition of the work of the Dutch 17th century artist Bartholomeus Breenberg. This was no easy task in the early 90s, as panel paintings were not routinely lent for exhibitions. He asked if he might be able to borrow the Getty's Breenberg, which you see here, along with a view of the decidedly heavy but perfectly stable cradle on the reverse. Despite the fact that the work had no structural problems whatsoever, my response was an unequivocal no. At that point in time, the Getty Museum had a blanket policy of simply not lending panel paintings, and for many years I was grateful for a policy that provided us with a convenient excuse to keep the collection at home. It was not a difficult policy for the museum to maintain, as we had no exhibitions program of our own, and thus, admittedly somewhat selfishly, felt no obligation to exchange works of art with other institutions. Now let's fast forward to a decade later, when a very different perspective came into play in relation to this panel painting, a Mars and Venus in the Forge of Vulcan that is one of the great collaborative works by Peter Paul Rubens and Jan Bruegel the Elder. The Getty acquired the picture in the year 2000, and it was sent to California from its home in London, where it had hung for many years in a dining room in a somewhat neglected house with dry, frigid conditions in the wintertime and hot, damp conditions in the summers. And here you see it in its previous home. The painting was not without some structural problems, as these after-cleaning photographs show, and clearly had experienced severe flaking in the past as a result of movement of the panel. And what you're looking on the right at a detail of this area of the picture, and you can see that the surface is simply covered with a blizzard of small flake losses. The reverse had been coated with a heavy layer of hemp fibers and lead white paint, most likely applied when the painting was in Italy, sometime between the mid-17th and late 19th centuries, and it was heavily cradled. Miraculously, we found that the original oak planks had never been thinned, and once the cradle, whitewash, and hemp fibers were removed, it was possible to stabilize the panel through fairly straightforward mending of a few horizontal splits near the original joins. And I should point out that this work was done by Johnny Marusic, who for about a 15-year period, beginning in the 1980s, came to the Getty on an annual basis and worked on all of our panels in the collection. But to return to the topic at hand, by this point in time, the museum had moved to the Getty Center, which had been constructed with an expansive special exhibitions pavilion that resulted in what could be characterized as a fairly voracious exhibitions program. After the acquisition of the Rubens Bruegel panel, we began working on the development of an exhibition dedicated to the collaborative works of these two artists, in partnership with the curatorial and conservation staff at the Moritz House. This, of course, meant that we would have to agree to send the panel, despite its complicated structural history, to our partners in the Netherlands for the second venue of the exhibition. Given its large size, we sent it without a climate box, depending with firm faith upon the stable environmental conditions at the Moritz House. This was a decision that was not made lightly, and it caused me any number of sleepless nights while the picture was in transit, but in the end it returned home safely and completely without incident. And as a result of the work for the exhibition, we learned much about the previously little understood nature of Rubens and Bruegel's artistic collaborations. And those discoveries were able to have a very public component as well. So that brings us to today's session, which is intended to look at some of the issues surrounding the ways in which we make use of the works of art that were created on panels. It seemed fitting to set the tone for the session with a curatorial perspective, and Maryan Ainsworth from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, who has spent most of her professional career working with artists who largely specialize in panel paintings, will start things off. So welcome, Maryan.
On May 28, 1483, Hugo van der Goes's enormous triptych known as the Portinari Altarpiece, measuring 253 by 304 centimeters closed, arrived at its destination, the Hospital of Santa Maria Nuova in Florence. The detailed account of its journey from Bruges to Florence would terrify any curator or conservator. This gigantic altarpiece, painted on commission for Tommaso Portinari, the representative of the Medici Bank in Bruges, was transported by ship from Bruges to a port in Sicily. Then it was transferred to a smaller vessel that sailed on the Arno from Pisa to Florence, where it was unloaded near the Porta San Friano, or today Porta San Frediano. And from there, it was brought by cart with wooden wheels over rough, unpaved streets to the Hospital of Santa Maria Nuova and installed on the main altar of the Church of Sant'Egidio. No less than 16 portatori participated in the transport. Needless to say, there was no climate-controlled crate and no air ride truck. Such a journey for a masterpiece of this importance, indeed the only securely documented work by Hugo van der Goes, would be unthinkable today. Yet if it were deemed absolutely necessary, possible conservation treatments, safe packing, and carefully considered transport could be provided today in a way unimaginable in the late 15th century. The issue of the care and transport of panel paintings for special exhibitions has reached somewhat of a confusing juncture where everything is possible and nothing is possible. It is always easier to say no. We've never been better informed about how to treat panels, pack them, and transport them for safe arrival at their destinations, yet attitudes and perceptions about lending panel paintings to exhibitions lag behind these new developments. What, of course, needs to be considered on a case-by-case basis is the question of risk balanced against the guaranteed benefits of sending panel paintings from their home institutions to other locations nationally and internationally. Years ago, in 1979, when John Brealey first came to the Metropolitan Museum as the new chairman of the Paintings Conservation Department, one of his first directives was to put a halt to lending paintings on panel. It was an absolute embargo, and his reason for doing so was to counter the indiscriminate lending of too many panels to too many exhibitions without proper consideration of issues of climate control or safe packing and transport. As you can well imagine, this had a significant impact on our relationships with other museums at the time. It was only a few years afterwards that an important exhibition, Raphael in America, staged by David Allen Brown at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, and the strong will of Sir John Pope Hennessy of the Met's European Paintings Department, broke the ban in order to lend the Met's Agony in the Garden to complete a predella of the Madonna of the Nuns of Sant'Antonio that was to be installed in the show. This ushered in a new era when each request began to be judged on its own merits. But it was nearly another decade before the Met took the next step in 1988 with its groundbreaking show, Painting in Siena, 1420 to 1500. Our director then, Philippe de Montebello, had initially nixed the idea, assuming that the loans could never be assembled for a representative show. However, Keith Christensen prevailed, and it actually happened, albeit with hardly any panel larger than what could be hand-carried in a Halliburton case. The Louvre did not participate because of their absolute refusal to lend panel paintings at the time, and their curator, Dominique Thiebaud, has always regretted that decision because of the new insights made possible by the assembled paintings at that show. Through this exhibition, Met staff members demonstrated to lenders their expertise in the special care devoted to panel painting issues, mainly through George Bazaka's efforts, and already by 1994, the situation began to change. In preparation for Petrus Christus, Renaissance master of Bruges, we actually had a wager ongoing of how many panels could be assembled for this exhibition. Out of the small oeuvre of 29 surviving works, 19 panels and a handful of drawings came to New York, allowing for a reevaluation of this important 15th century Netherlandish master in the first monographic show ever devoted to him. Even those panels that could not be lent were studied along with others from the technical point of view, thus offering for the first time a more or less complete picture of the working methods of the artist. I always thought that our thorough efforts regarding technical examination of all of the panels helped our cause in regard to institutional willingness to lend. I'm not so naive as to pretend that there are not quid pro quo issues and political strong-arming that occur in decision-making of museums about which paintings may be allowed to travel to which exhibitions. One hears that there are even questions of special fees involved. Why else would the Last Judgment triptych, Hans Memling's monumental early work commissioned in 1467 by Angelo Tani, probably for the Church of the Badia Fiorelesana in Florence, and measuring 242 by 180 centimeters, including the frame when closed, have been lent in 1993 to the Cologne exhibition on Stefan Lochner? This is an altarpiece that was one of two aboard a galley ship seized just beyond the Zwin River in Bruges on April 27, 1473, by the privateer Paul Benecke, working on behalf of the Hanseatic League. The theft was reported to Tommaso Portinari on the 12th of July that same year. But despite the intervention of the Pope and Duke Charles the Bold, the altarpiece, which was taken to Gdansk and installed on the altar of the Guild of St. George in the Church of Our Lady, was never returned to its rightful owner. So it was from Gdansk, or present-day Danzig, that the huge altarpiece was transported in 1993-94 to not just one, but two exhibitions by truck over bumpy roads. It was shown first in the Stefan Lochner exhibition, where there was no apparent reason for its inclusion. Memling's great altarpiece was influenced significantly by Roger van der Weyden's Bone Last Judgment, not by Stefan Lochner's work of the same theme. Subsequently, it traveled to the 1994 monographic show on Hans Memling. For this, ironically, the mammoth altarpiece returned to Bruges, from whence it had been stolen in the waterways just beyond the town walls some 520 years earlier. This is the category of unreasonable risk, and if I were the responsible curator, I would not have put Memling's huge altarpiece in such jeopardy, nor would I probably have allowed Hans Holbein the Younger's enormous masterpiece, the so-called Darmstadt Madonna, to travel to Portland, Oregon, for a show on the treasures of the Hesse dynasty. The present-day Hesse family was at the time dangling the picture like a carrot before the eyes of all covetous buyers for a rumored $100 million. More appropriate for such an exceptional loan was its presence at the landmark show of Hans Holbein the Younger in Basel in 2005, where it could be seen in the context of the other works of the artist from the Basel years. Ultimately, of course, the Darmstadt Madonna landed on long-term loan in the Frankfurt Städel Museum, where it can be enjoyed by the public. This brings me to the question of what is reasonable risk for sending panel paintings near and far for special exhibitions. When do the benefits outweigh the dangers? The Metropolitan Museum owns some large-scale works which are regularly requested for loan, but may never travel anywhere due to the fragile state of the wood supports. Bruegel's Harvesters and the D'Antville Allegory are roughly comparable in height and width and also similar in their extremely thin panels. How wonderful it would be to see the Harvesters reunited with the other 4 remaining months in Bruegel's series of 6, made for Nicholas Jongelink in 1565 for his villa outside Antwerp at Terbeken. Or how interesting it would be to study firsthand the connections between the Met's D'Antville Allegory at the right and Holbein's Ambassadors in the National Gallery, London. Both were commissioned by Jean de D'Antville and his brothers, and once hung in close proximity in the D'Antville Chateau at Policy. The Ambassadors has its own checkered history and condition problems, and when the remarkable exhibition of Holbein in England was staged at the Tate Gallery in 2006, there was considerable public outrage over the fact that it could not be moved even the short distance across town from the National Gallery to the Tate in order to represent the peak of Holbein's production in his London years. Made of 10 vertical planks, planed to around 5 millimeters thick, the panel has a history of splitting and flaking paint, and it was just too risky to move anywhere. This same exhibition of Holbein in England also presented somewhat of a quandary for us at the Metropolitan Museum. In 2003, the Mauritshuis in The Hague staged an exhibition, Hans Holbein, Portraitist of the Renaissance, and requested what is one of the most important paintings in our Northern Renaissance collection, Holbein's portrait of Hermann von Wedig. New technical research had been done on the fine collection of Holbein portraits at the Mauritshuis, and this exhibition promised to be revelatory about the artist's technique and handling. We deliberated long and hard about our portrait, but rather than concern over questionable state and condition, we considered the Wedig portrait to be in such remarkably fine condition that we felt reluctant to lend it. Convinced that the benefits of viewing the Wedig portrait alongside others of the same period would outweigh the risks, we decided to lend it to The Hague. Imagine our quandary, then, when within the year we were approached again for the same portrait for a larger and even more important exhibition 2 years later of Holbein in England at the Tate, to be curated by my London colleague and the expert on Holbein's English years, Susan Foister. The subtleties of execution and handling to be experienced and enjoyed in a portrait of such extraordinary condition as the Wedig portrait are transforming. And it is especially through the opportunity to compare these qualities of Holbein's portraits that we come to understand what it was exactly that made him the most important portraitist of his day, those so-called appellees of his time. How could any viewer understand this unless such comparisons could be made? So, once again, we agreed exceptionally to lend the Wedig portrait to the very important exhibition, where it was installed directly in the line of sight as the visitor turned the corner into the room of Holbein's portraits of the Hanseatic League in London. There it provided the epitome of the artist's technical achievements in a painting of nearly pristine state, against which all other portraits in the room and in the exhibition could be measured. We were very glad indeed to have had the opportunity to see the Met portrait in comparison with the others of this date in London, such as the Berlin portrait of another member of the Wedig family that you see at the right. I can tell you now that the Met's Wedig portrait is home to stay for a good long time. Of rather different nature were our deliberations over whether or not to send our Annunciation panels by Gerard David to Genoa, to the Palazzo Bianco, to be reunited with other panels from the same altarpiece. The Metropolitan owns the largest collection of paintings by Gerard David in the world, although not his large altarpieces, for which one needs to travel to Bruges and elsewhere. Out of character for early Netherlandish painting is this enunciation that uncommonly is divided into two panels, with a perspective system indicated by a tipped-up floor tiles. The pair is meant to be viewed from below and at a considerable distance. Already in the 1970s, Max Friedlander had proposed that 3 paintings in the Palazzo Bianco and 1 in the Louvre belonged with the Met's panels in a configuration more typical of North Italian polyptychs. But it was not until my further research for a book on Gerard David in 1998 that I became convinced that the Palazzo Bianco crucifixion by David was also a component of this ensemble. From documents, we know that the altarpiece was commissioned in 1506 by Vincenzo Zauli for the high altar of San Girolamo della Cervara, the Benedictine abbey in Liguria, on the coast of Italy. You can imagine my excitement when Clario Di Fabio, then director of the Palazzo Bianco, approached us about reuniting all of the panels of this important altarpiece for an anniversary celebration of that Genoa museum. Such an opportunity would once and for all allow examination of my proposed reconstruction and questions concerning the exact details of the commission for the in situ placement of this Italian-style altarpiece, and further possible resolution of the issue as to whether David ever went to Italy for his most important foreign commission. The Met's Gabriel and Virgin Mary had never traveled to an exhibition since they came to the Met in 1940. The panels are not small, each measuring around 79 by 64 centimeters, and uncommonly thick for Baltic oak planks, about 3 centimeters. In discussions with George Bazaka, we carefully evaluated the questions of packing and transport, and the Met's paintings were made ready for safe travel to Genoa. We learned a great deal from a thorough technical examination that was undertaken on this altarpiece in a collaboration between the New York and Genoese colleagues, and subsequently we published this new information in a booklet at the time of the exhibition in Genoa. Nothing in this publication, however, can compare with the first-hand viewing experience of all 7 panels together in an arrangement very close indeed to what must be considered Gerard David's most carefully planned and executed polyptych in Italian style for its 1506 installation on the high altar of San Girolamo della Cervara. Like pieces of a puzzle, each panel locked into its proper place, instantly providing the hoped-for justification for the perspective system so carefully planned in the tile design of the first and second tiers of paintings, of the diminution of scale of the figures for the first and second levels, and the looming presence of the large-scale figure of the omnipotent blessing God the Father in the lunette at the top. A small but highly focused exhibition such as this that yields such stunning results is powerful visual and scholarly justification for lending such panel paintings abroad. A third reason for taking the risk of lending panel paintings to exhibitions is to help solve questions of attribution and dating. The Met's Adoration of the Magi at the left was long considered a late pastiche of elements appropriated from paintings by Hieronymus Bosch. When dendrochronology of another version of the same composition in Rotterdam, which is at the right, revealed a date of around 1540, the Met painting was placed in the same category of late copy and pastiche. However, the opportunity to compare the Met painting directly with the Rotterdam version in the monographic exhibition in Rotterdam in 2001 made it abundantly clear that they differed substantially in technique, handling, and execution. The Met's painting fits in well with Bosch's works of around 1475 to 80, and the Rotterdam painting shows a later, less complicated layering structure indicative of developments of around 1540, which had been confirmed by the dendrochronological dating. Furthermore, the chance to compare the Met painting with the Ecce Homo from Frankfurt and other early Bosch paintings allowed it to take its rightful place among the earliest of Bosch's paintings. Further technical examination of the Met's adoration through dendrochronology, infrared reflectography, and microscopic examination of the paint layers have supported this conclusion. Certain exhibitions can only be planned for one venue. The Prado in Madrid was the only logical place for a once-in-a-lifetime exhibition on Joachim Portinari to be even contemplated. The Prado happens to own the majority of Portinari's large-scale works, and the most important ones by the artist. Therefore, when word reached us that the Prado was contemplating a monographic show, we had to take it seriously. However, the request was for our St. Jerome triptych, a large-scale work that had never traveled anywhere outside the museum since its acquisition in 1936. Careful study of the state and condition of the paintings with Hubert von Sonnenberg, then chairman of the Paintings Conservation Department, and George Bazaka, led to the conclusion that the panels were actually quite secure and that we could perhaps consider sending these panels to Madrid. George recommended some work on the central panel that would additionally ensure a condition safe for travel. He soon set to work on carrying out the treatment on several small splits, as you can see at the right, in the central panel, so that the triptych afterwards could be observed in our museum climate for a period of time in order to evaluate any further developing issues before plans for travel were finalized. Safe packing and transport were equally important and troublesome issues to consider. As many of you well know, there are no cargo planes anymore between New York and Madrid. Therefore, the triptych would have had to go to an airport in France and then be trucked the remainder of the way to Madrid. I was not comfortable with this scenario. Then George came up with a viable plan. The wings could be easily detached from the central panel, and these could be packed together in one crate, while the central panel could be packed in another crate. The two crates would travel separately in two different planes with two different couriers, fitting into the cargo hold of a regular commercial airline. Therefore, there could be direct nonstop transportation from New York to Madrid. George would be available on the other end in Madrid to reconnect the wings of the central panel and supervise the installation of the triptych along with me. And here, of course, you see George and Jose looking for the central panel. They did find it and were able to reinstall it there. The Met's triptych was installed near the Baptism of Christ from the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna, to which it has always been compared because of the similar figures in each of the Baptism of Christ. Although both derive from the same motif in Gerard David's baptism triptych, this factor has confused rather than clarified their relationship, even leading some to consider the Met's triptych as a late pastiche after works by Portinari. The chance to see the New York and the Vienna pictures side by side further clarified that the Vienna picture is indeed later and more sophisticated in composition, technique, and execution than the Met picture. In addition, comparisons with other paintings in the Madrid show made possible by the loan of the Met triptych allowed for the reconsideration of its date, that the traditional date of around 1518 is too late, and that it may well predate even 1515 when Portinari's name first appears in the records of Antwerp's Painters' Guild. We now consider our triptych to be Portinari's earliest surviving large-scale triptych, dating around 1510 to 12. In this curator's experience, there have definitely been risks worth taking in sending panel paintings to exhibitions where there are guaranteed rewards. Such rewards include a better understanding of the artist's technique and execution in extraordinarily well-preserved pictures, the chance to see a certain painting reunited with others that are part of the same original ensemble, and clarification of attribution and dating issues. I realize, of course, that I have presented points here that are all key connoisseurship questions. That is not to say that I only favor sending panel paintings to exhibitions that primarily deal with connoisseurship problems. Certainly, however, the case may be made stronger for such presentations. However, there are equally valid reasons for sending panels to other types of shows, but here the example requested might find ready substitutes in other more easily available works. I'm currently preparing an exhibition on Jan Gossart in the context of the art of his time. Gossart is credited with bringing Italian Renaissance art, especially large-scale nudes and mythological subjects, to Northern Europe, especially to the Burgundian Netherlands for the first time. The only previous monographic show on the artist was the 1965 show in Bruges and Rotterdam, never in America. In preparation for this show, I have endeavored, with excellent cooperation of conservators and conservation scientists in many museums, to make a technical study of as many of the paintings as possible. This has yielded extremely rich results that will contribute to a significant reappraisal of Gossart's oeuvre. The reasons for lending panels to this show in New York, which has a smaller second venue in London, are therefore even more fully argued than usual. It has been an enormous advantage in so many of these negotiations to have the expertise of George Bazaka in carefully evaluating the pros and cons of individual loans and in discussing these issues with the curators and conservators of potential lending institutions. It's most interesting, therefore, to see which panel paintings were easily lent to the 1965 Bruges and Rotterdam shows, like the Prague St. Luke painting, drawing the Virgin and Child, which is an enormous picture, and won't be lent at this time, and which of these can be lent now. We shall see in October of 2010 how fully represented Gossart will be, and I'm very hopeful. But it's become quite clear to me that those institutions where the easy answer is no are not represented at this conference. They appear not to be involved in the current research and discussions on panel painting problems and solutions. If I were to sum up my thoughts about special exhibitions and panel paintings, I would say the following. Although many museums now evaluate requests on a case-by-case basis, not all museums do this. My hope would be that the Getty Panel Painting Initiative would become much more widely known, and this conference is a marvelous step in that direction. New initiatives need to be made with institutions, conservators, and curators in Germany and Belgium, in France, in particular, those countries who are not well represented at this event. The latest studies and information about the impact of various types of packing and transport conditions and the effects of environmental differences from the home institution to that of the exhibition need to be more widely disseminated. These recent advances in our knowledge need to be communicated not only to conservators but also to curators, who need to learn how to understand the data for evaluating a given loan request. There has to be better communication between conservators and curators. Above all, let us keep in mind how best we can represent the achievements of old master panel painters in carefully thought-out exhibitions. Given developments in conservation treatments and special care and handling and packing and transport over the last decade, the possible risks of lending panel paintings is now often smaller than the benefits of marvelous new insights into the works of artists of long ago. Let us collectively find ways to achieve advances in our knowledge and appreciation of the mastery of these painters. Thank you.